For a couple weeks now, we've been in this series that we've entitled, He Said What? As we're looking at some of the difficult statements that Jesus made. And some of them are difficult to understand, some are difficult to take in and to apply to our lives, some are all of the above. And today, we're going to look at a statement that I believe is not going to hit us as being a radical, challenging statement right off the bat. Right, there are some of those, like last week, Pastor Mike did a great job talking about, when Jesus said, unless you hate your father and mother and all the other close relationships you have, you can't be my disciple. And we lean forward, we go, what? Several weeks ago, we looked at where Jesus said this, where he said, all the sins can be forgiven, but there's one sin that God cannot forgive. What is the unpardonable sin in that one sin that God says he cannot forgive? What is that? That causes us immediately to lean forward. But today, I think we're going to see this passage here and see and hear what Jesus says, and we'll go, I'm not sure why that's really radical. Because this requires a little bit of translation on our part to understand just how over the top Jesus' claim is on this day. So let's read through this, and then we're going to break it down together when Jesus is going to help us understand how he said, I'm the final temple. This is out of John chapter 2. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. The Jews then responded to him, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Now, when we hear that, my guess is we might not immediately be leaning forward and going, that's shocking. But I guarantee you, to the people who heard it on that day, it was shocking. But what it requires us to do is to dive a little bit into the time and the place and understand why the temple played the role that it did and what Jesus was saying in contrast to the common understanding. So let me give you a little heads up of where we're going to be going. We're going to talk about the role of the temple, about how radical the claim that Jesus makes truly is. And then we're going to ask the question, so what? What does that mean to people like us all these years later? What are the implications of what Jesus said on that day? So let's begin with the role of the temple. And it would be impossible for us to overstate how important that building was in that time, in that culture, and in that space. And the events play out around the building that looks a lot like this. This is a recreation of the temple in Jesus' day. Now, when Jesus said these words, it was under construction. It was finished about 20 years later and then knocked down about 20 years after that. But they're standing in the courts, and there's all this chaos happening with buying and selling that's going on. And what did that place mean? What was that building all about? Let me suggest a couple things to you that really are important to our understanding of its role. First, it served as the cosmic crossroads. That this idea that there is something bigger and better and beyond us, something ultimate or someone ultimate. And if you go the world over, I think what you'll find is that not just in this community in Jesus' day, but you go all around the world and people have this instinctive sense that there's something beyond us. There's something more than me, myself, and I. And there's an ultimate purpose, an ultimate reason, an ultimate being, something for which we were made. And often people have this longing, this hunger, this sense, what am I missing? And I was made for something more. And that's why not just in Jerusalem, but you go into the farthest corners of the earth and there are buildings there are shrines there, and all different ways in which to create this sense that if there is a spiritual ultimate reality, if there's something supernatural, and then here we live in the natural world, where do those things intersect? Where can we engage that thing that is beyond us, that meaning that is bigger than us. Well, the temple served that role, where the supernatural and the natural intersected, where heaven meets earth. And in that sacred square footage was the idea that that's where you go to connect with that sense of something bigger and better and beyond ourselves. In addition to that, the temple served as the house of the divine presence. That there is where the presence of God resided, or that spiritual reality that is bigger, and you went there to make contact with that. It wasn't with you on your day-by-day, ordinary, moment-by-moment life. You had to go to that place in order to connect with it, and so the temple was the place that you went to make that kind of contact. And then also, it was the bridge across the gap that separates us from that ultimate reality, that mystery. It answers those questions of who are we and why are we here and where do we come from and what are we ultimately here to do. But what often happens in this world is that people live with a sense that we've been cut off from that and that we need to connect with that, to overcome that gap. And so often that's the role that the temple plays. And that's why it was so central and so important in this passage and in this culture. But really, you can go around the world and say the same thing. And so if you've ever wrestled with that sense of is there more, you are certainly not alone. And C.S. Lewis is somebody who spoke to this, I think, in a very profound way. This is a quote from a message, a sermon that he called The Weight of Glory. He said, the inconsolable secret in every one of us, the secret that hurts so much, that you take revenge on by calling it nostalgia or romanticism or adolescence, that is our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off. The longing to be on the inside of some door that we've always seen from the outside. That inconsolable longing, that secret fantasy is no neurotic fantasy, something we made up. It is a longing for a real situation. The sense that in this universe we are strangers, a longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality is part of our inconsolable secret. It's to please God, to be a real ingredient in divine happiness, to be loved by God, not just pitied, but delighted in as artists delight in their work. It's acceptance by God, response, delight, acknowledgement, welcome into the heart of things. Then the door on which we have been knocking all of our lives will open at last. And if you know anything about those words and what that longing is in the human heart, what Jesus has to say on that day is still as relevant as it was then. It still is now. So the role of the temple, huge. It's where you make contact with something and someone beyond yourself. So with that in mind, and understanding a little bit more about the role, let's talk about why Jesus' claim is so radical on that day. And what he was doing in the statement that he made, so it goes something like this: destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. A temple he had spoken of was his body. And what Jesus makes in that statement is two claims, two massive, over-the-top, either they're outrageously crazy or the implications of it change everything. But there is no nice, calm, intermediate place where we can just say, well, that's interesting. It's either outrageous or the implications of it for people like us are off the charts. Well, what are those two statements? Let's look at them one at a time. Here's what Jesus is saying. I'm the ultimate reality you seek. You know that hunger and that longing inside of your heart that's found across the globe? What you've been looking for, what you've been seeking, what your heart has been yearning for is me. And if Jesus had said in this moment, well, hey, I'm kind of like the temple, or I'm similar to the temple, or he had been speaking metaphorically, right? If he had just said, destroy this temple, I'll raise it again in 3 days. Well, that's interesting. And maybe Jesus would be like, any other religious leader that's come along who says, well, I can kind of guide you to God, or I have a measure of the divinity in me. But he says something beyond that because he was speaking about his body, himself. Here's what Jesus is saying, that in me is the presence of that ultimate reality. That mystery is answered in me. And what you were created for is here in bodily form. In the New Testament, one of the writers says this, that in him, in Jesus, all the fullness of deity dwelled in bodily form. Everything that was sought in that place and everything that it represented, he's the completion of that. He is the full expression of that. And if you back up a little bit and go into the Old Testament when the temple was first created, we get a picture of this and how over the top Jesus' claim is. Because on the day the temple was built and it was dedicated, the king who built it, his name was Solomon, prayed a prayer and then something happened. Let me show it to you. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices that were there on the altar, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And in the Jewish culture, they would refer to the glory of the Lord as the Shekinah glory. That means the dwelling presence of God. So they built this building, but then all of a sudden on this dedication, here comes fire and here comes this presence that we're going to see. The people who were there couldn't just look at it and go, well, that's interesting. They had to get away from it because it was so overwhelming that their being, in and of who they were in themselves, could not handle that presence that was there. And this picture also takes us back, if you know anything about Moses going to the top of Mount Sinai and meeting with God to get the Ten Commandments. What happened on top of that mountain? There was fire and there was smoke, and it was like an earthquake and a hurricane all at once, but there was this divine presence of God, and the people ran away from it because they were afraid, because they were like, that is overwhelming. And here it is on this day in which the temple is dedicated. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord. Why? Because the glory of the Lord filled it. When all the Israelites saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground and they worshiped. And you know what Jesus is saying on that day when he walks into the temple courts? That's me. And that is present in me, in my body. I'm not speaking metaphorically. It's me. Do we begin to understand how radical Jesus' claim really is? That everything the temple was about and all that it pointed to has now been fulfilled ultimately in him. So not only does he say that I am the ultimate reality that you seek, I'm the God who's on the other side of your search. I'm the God who's on the other side of that door maybe you've been knocking on and longing from, and you can see it from the outside. But if you open that door and got to the other side, Jesus is saying, I'm there. Here's what else he's saying. That I am the altar, the sacrifice, and the bridge across the gap. Right? Because in the temple, you would bring your sacrifice and you would make that sacrifice. You would pray. You would participate in the things that were happening there. But there was a lot that you needed to do with the expectation that God would respond. But now what is Jesus saying is that he is going to be the fulfillment of all of that pictured in advance. Because what was destroyed and then raised again in 3 days? It wasn't a building. It was Jesus. He's talking about his death and then 3 days later, his resurrection as he walked out of a tomb alive again. And so what he's saying is everything that's been pictured in the temple, where you can make contact with the divine, where you can experience that ultimate sense of your purpose and the ultimate reality for which we were made, and for all that comes along with it, to bridge that gap. That's what I'm here to do. Not only am I the God on the other side of that mystery, I'm the bridge to get you there. Because what I will do, I'm the sacrifice. I'm the altar. I'm the priest. And I will lead you to that ultimate reality that is a relationship with God. Jesus is talking about a different kind of temple altogether. And in saying this and recognizing that he is the fulfillment of all that I pictured, Jesus is making every other temple obsolete, because what they were all to do were fulfilled in him. This is a unique claim that no other religious leader ever made, not even close. So either this is craziness or it changes everything. But the people who were there understood it to be an over-the-top, radical claim. So let's ask this question then. So what? What does that mean for us? What are the implications of that for people like us? Let me suggest a few things to you. It's the difference between do versus done. When we come to this passage, many times people will look at it from this perspective, that what Jesus was addressing and what he was driving out of there was the commercialism. People, were buying and selling, and they were extorting some money by putting, higher prices on things. And certainly that is an aspect of it. But really what Jesus is picturing for us in this moment and what he does is the two basic approaches when we come to an idea that there even is a God. There are a couple of different ways to do that, and it's pictured for us in the statement that Jesus makes. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. And there's the contrast, a market and my Father's house. Well, how's that a contrast? Right, the market was going to the temple and you had to pay a price to buy a sacrifice, and you had to bring the sacrifice. You had to take it in there, and you had to participate in certain ways. You were doing things with the expectation that God would do something in response. But now Jesus shows up, and he uses language that communicates intimacy and family. And he says, no, this is my Father's house. I will finish the work, but you've been invited into a relationship. And so if you, in your life, if you participated in spiritual things, religious activities, but you haven't felt or sensed the intimacy of that, it just felt exhausting and empty and dry, it might be, because you have been trying to relate to God in a marketplace kind of relationship. Because when we do in order with the expectation to receive in return, we have now entered into a transaction with God. I've done my part, and now God, you do your part. But Jesus shows up that day and goes, that's over. And now the fulfillment of all of that is here. But I'm going to do the work. And you can come into my Father's house. And we can journey from there. You don't do something to get. You get to go there to understand all that he's done for you. So here's one of the implications of this. There can be people, maybe two people, sitting side by side in a room, the same room, with the same message and the same everything happening in that moment, but they can be sitting in two different temples. One person could be sitting in a marketplace kind of temple where the expectation is, I got to show up and I got to participate and I got to do the stuff and I got to, show God, that I'm really sincere, with the expectation that God's going to do something in return. And if you've ever, wondered, God, why are my prayers not being answered? Because I feel like I've done my part, but I don't feel like you've done your part. That is a marketplace transactional relationship with God. But maybe somebody's sitting in that same room right next to the other person, and they're there because they recognize he did it all. And I don't have to prove anything, and I don't have to do anything when it comes to God, because it's not about my work. It's about his grace and what he did for me. And so now I am trying to anchor in the depths of my soul the reality of all that God has accomplished on my purpose, so that I can live that out and live in light of that, and not ride the roller coaster of living in this world with the opinions of others, because the opinion of the God of this universe has been settled once and for all time. See, there's two different kinds of temples, two different approaches to God. So which temple are you in? So one of the implications is do versus done as we approach a relationship with God. Here's another one, implication. Jesus has the final authority. Right, Jesus walks into the temple and he starts turning over tables, makes a whip and drives people out. And the leaders who were there go, hey, show us a sign, to indicate whose authority you have to do that. Who do you think you are? So let me ask you this question. If I came over to your house today and I walked into your house, and what if you heard this from me? You know, these curtains in here, they got to go. And this couch, you know, I'm sure it was something back in 1988, but let's get that out. And this wallpaper, nobody uses wallpaper. That would be a weird exchange, right? For me to walk into your place, right? I'm a guest there. It's your place. You know what Jesus is doing on this day? When he shows up in the temple, he's saying, this is my house. I'm not a guest here. I'm the owner. And so I have the right to rearrange the furniture. I have the authority. But let's make that a little bit more personal and bring that to your life and to mine. Because Jesus has the final authority in the hearts and lives of people who put hope and trust in him. So does Jesus have the right to rearrange the furniture of your life and mine? Or do we treat him like a guest, like a consultant? And we'll take what you say under advisement, but I'll hold the final card. Jesus has final authority. You know, over the years, people have asked me a lot of questions about following Jesus, and some of them kind of go in this vein, where they say, so if I follow Jesus, am I going to have to stop sleeping with my girlfriend? If that's where we're starting the question, with all due respect, you're starting in the wrong place. Where we need to start is, who is he? Who is he and what authority does he have? But if we're going to come with those kind of conditions of, God, I want you in my life, but not if it's going to change this, 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 and this, we are making a God of our own. It's a God of our own making. And on this day, Jesus makes it clear he's the owner, not a guest. And so as we come to him, you know, we commit to him. Of course, we may not answer every question that comes along with it, but we go on this adventure, this journey where he has the authority over our lives and defines the parameters and the boundaries for that. And not a guest. The disciples that day said, man, when we saw him in action, it reminded us of a quote from the Psalms, zeal for your house will consume me. Can I just transfer that a little bit to people like you and me? Zeal for your life consumes him. But does he have final authority? Because he's the owner and not a guest. One more implication of this is call to make room for more. Where these events play out in the temple grounds was referred to as the court of the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are people who are not Jewish, right? They were from other countries, often pagan sort of backgrounds. But God, in the very design of the temple, created a place for people who were searching, people who were seeking, people who were curious, people who were longing to satisfy that hunger in their souls. And there was a place for them to come. Now imagine if that's where the marketplace was. Could you even pray there? Because it was so loud and the stench was probably so bad. How did it get to that place? And a lot of commentators point to this, that the people who were on the inside, who didn't have to deal with all that, their basic attitude was, who cares? We're good. Let them deal with it. And Jesus drives those people out of that place. Why? Because everybody matters to God. Everybody. In Mark's account of this story, he adds this detail as he quotes the book of Isaiah. My house will be called a house of prayer for who? All nations. All nations. The heart of God is reaching to all people. Everybody matters to him. And you may ask, well, why don't we do temples anymore? Why, don't we have, those kind of same buildings that are built according to the Old Testament structure? Because the implications of what Jesus said on that day changed everything. There's a whole different structure now. So where's a temple? Let me break this to you. If you put hope and trust in Jesus, it's in you. That we are being built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices to God through Jesus Christ. That's the radical implication of what Jesus said and did on that day. Jesus is the final temple. But let me ask you this question. We've asked it already. Which temple are you in? Are you in the temple where you do with the expectation to get from God? I'll do my part. Now, God, you do yours. Or are we in the temple where we just roll our eyes in wonder sometimes at who God is and what he's done for us, and try to work into the depths of our soul what that means so that it pours out of these lives of ours? Which temple are you in? What about the temple of authority, where Jesus has the final say, where he's the owner? Or are we trying to relate to God with our conditions and our sort of maybe prenuptial kind of ideas of, God, I want you in my life, but not if it means this and this and this? Which temple are you in? And if the heart of God is reaching out to all people and all the nations matter to him, is there room for that in our lives? Do we care about the people that matter so much to God and create space and invite them to experience what they were made for? Which temple are you in? Would you bow your heads together with me? So God, we are amazed at who you are. And Lord Jesus, you came to show us ultimate things. The ultimate things that in this world we, for a long time, just assumed we don't need those spiritual things anymore. We'll figure out all the answers with reason and with rationale, but here we are still hungering and longing for that connection with you. And God, you told us what we were looking for. What we were made for is you. And thank you for opening the door to a relationship with you. And now, God, do your work in us and through us in ways that shows us how you have finished the work. And we got nothing to prove. But help us to draw close to you and to live out the reality of what this means. Not with an expectation of what you will do in return, but because of who you are and all that you've done for us. Lead us in that direction, God, for your name's sake. We ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.